The room went quiet the moment she said the word mom, and I knew before my heart even caught up that she wasn't talking about me. I remember the way the microphone hummed softly in her hand, a low, nervous sound, like it was holding its breath along with the rest of us. The lights above the stage were too bright, the kind that make people squint before they smile, and I watched her blink twice before lifting her chin. It was a charity luncheon, one of those polished community events with white tablecloths, crystal water glasses, and napkins folded into shapes no one ever unfolded properly. The kind of place where applause comes easily, even when emotions don't. I sat near the front, my coat folded neatly on my lap. My hands rested on top of it, fingers laced together the way they always do when I'm trying to stay calm, trying to look like I belong exactly where I am. My daughter-in-law stood tall at the podium. Composed, confident, her voice carried well across the room, steady, practiced, the voice of someone who had learned how to sound certain even when she was. She thanked the organizers, the sponsors, her colleagues. She thanked her husband, my son, who stood off to the side, smiling with that proud, boyish grin he's had since childhood. Then she paused, just a breath, barely a second, but long enough for me to lift my head fully, long enough for something inside me to tighten. And finally, she said, her voice softening, I want to thank the woman who's been my mother in every way that matters. Thank you, Mom. The word echoed even though she didn't raise her voice. People turned in their chairs, applause rose, warm and immediate. Someone near the back sniffed, already reaching for a tissue. I followed her gaze, already knowing what I'd see. A woman stood slowly from her seat near the back row, one hand pressed to her chest, the other wiping at her eyes. She nodded through her tears, smiling like she'd just been given something precious. I stayed still. I clapped because everyone else did, my palms meeting lightly, carefully, like I didn't trust them to make too much noise. My face held a smile that felt borrowed, pinned on. Something I could return later when no one was watching. Because in that moment, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to see for years. I was no longer waiting to be chosen. I had already been replaced. Before that day, my life was quiet in the way only time can make it. Not lonely, just settled. I lived in the same house my husband and I bought when our son was 5. The one with the creaky stair near the hallway and the rose bush out front that I trimmed every spring whether it bloomed or not. My husband passed 8 years ago, and after that, time changed its pace. Mornings stretched out, slow and thoughtful. Evenings slipped by before I noticed. I spoke to my son almost every day. Sometimes it was just a quick call, did you eat, how was work? And sometimes longer conversations when he was driving home, his voice filling the quiet spaces of my kitchen. When he married her, I told myself things would change, but not in ways that mattered. I believed love multiplied. I believed families expanded. In the beginning, she was polite, careful. The kind of woman who remembered birthdays because her phone reminded her, who said thank you even when her eyes didn't quite match the words. When they moved into their first place together, I brought casseroles wrapped in foil and folded towels the way I taught my son, edges aligned, corners neat. I pretended not to notice when she refolded them later. I told myself that was normal. Different households had different rhythms, different rules. On Sundays, they came over for dinner. I cooked the same meals I always had: roast chicken with lemon, potatoes soft enough to break with a fork, green beans sautéed just until they sighed in the pan. She ate quietly, complimented the seasoning, never asked for seconds. My son did. That part stayed the same, and I held on to it longer than I should have. There were small moments, though, easy to dismiss, easy to excuse, the way she'd step out of the room when I started telling stories about my son's childhood. The way she'd say, we already have plans, without looking at me when I invited them for holidays. The way she called her own mother for advice even about things I'd lived through decades ago. Still, I smiled, I listened, I stayed in my place. Because that's what you do when you're afraid of being pushed further out. The first real crack came a year before the luncheon, though I didn't recognize it then. She'd won a small award at work, nothing national, just regional, but it mattered to her. My son called me the night before, excitement buzzing in his voice. She's nervous, he said, you know how she gets. At the ceremony, I sat beside him. She waved once before heading backstage. When she returned to accept the award, she thanked her team, her mentors, her friends. She thanked my son, then she thanked her mother, seated several tables behind me. I felt it then, a small, sharp pinch, manageable, like stepping on a tack you could pull out later. Afterward, I mentioned it lightly. "It was a lovely speech," I said as we walked to the car. "I didn't realize your mother had been so involved in your career." She smiled, tight, polite. "She's always been there for me, that was all." After that, things shifted quietly. Invitations stopped coming directly to me. I heard about plans through my son, always late, always optional. "If you want to join," he'd say, "no pressure." And the hardest part wasn't being left out. It was the pretending that nothing had changed. The luncheon was different, bigger, public, intentional. When she said mom that day, it wasn't a mistake, it was a decision. I watched her step down from the stage, watched the woman she'd honored stand to embrace her, tears streaking her makeup as cameras flashed. I heard people whisper. I saw my son clapping, his eyes fixed anywhere but on me. I don't know how long I stayed seated after it ended. Long enough for the coffee to go cold. Long enough for the room to empty. Long enough to understand that the role I thought I held in her life had only existed because I'd hoped it did. And strangely, unexpectedly, I felt lighter, not because it didn't hurt. It did, deeply, quietly, but because the waiting was over. That night, I stood alone in my kitchen, listening to the refrigerator hum and the clock tick, the house breathing around me. I thought about all the times I'd swallowed words, softened myself, tried to be less so I wouldn't become nothing. And for the first time, I asked the question I'd been avoiding. What if this wasn't rejection, but release? After the luncheon, life didn't explode the way I half expected it to. There were no dramatic phone calls, no apologies delivered in hushed voices, no explanations wrapped in careful language. Life did what it always does, it continued. Quietly, indifferently, and in that quiet the truth had room to settle. The next morning I woke before my alarm, the way I often do now. Dawn slid through the curtains in thin, pale strips, landing on the dresser where my husband's watch still sat, unmoving. I made coffee out of habit, not desire. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and familiar, but it didn't comfort me the way it once had. I sat at the table and replayed the sound of her voice in my head. Mom, not whispered, not accidental, clear, confident, claimed. I wondered when she'd decided it. I wondered how long everyone else had known. By mid-morning, my son called. His name lit up my phone, and for a moment I considered letting it ring, not out of spite, out of exhaustion. But I answered because I always do. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice careful in a way that immediately told me he knew. "Did you get home okay last night?" "Yes," I said, "I did." There was a pause, not long, but heavy. I could hear him breathing, the faint sound of traffic through his car window. "I wanted to check in," he said. "It was a big night." "It was," I replied. I kept my voice even, calm. I didn't give him anything to react to. Another pause. He didn't ask how I felt. He didn't explain. Instead, he filled the space with logistics, his schedule, the weather, how tired she'd been afterward. I listened, nodded where appropriate, murmured agreement. When we hung up, my chest felt tight, like I'd been holding something in for too long. That was the pattern, I realized. Not just now, always. They never asked me how I felt. They assumed I'd adjust. Before all of this, my days had a rhythm. I volunteered twice a week at the library, reshelving books and helping children find stories that made their eyes light up. On Wednesdays, I met my neighbor for a walk around the block, our conversations circling familiar topics, aches and pains, rising grocery prices, the neighbor's unruly hedges. On Sundays, I cooked, even when no one came. Cooking reminded me I was capable of nourishing something. My son and his wife used to visit more often. Not constantly, but enough that I felt included. We'd sit in the living room after dinner, the television murmuring in the background while conversation drifted lazily from topic to topic. She'd check her phone often, but she'd smile when she spoke, nod when I talked. Looking back, I can see how carefully she kept the space between us intact. She never argued with me, never raised her voice, never said a harsh word. Her distance was polite, precise. A series of small decisions that added up to something unmistakable. It started with the holidays. The first Christmas after their wedding, they came over early in the morning. She brought a store-bought pie still in its plastic container and placed it carefully on the counter as if worried it might stain something. We exchanged gifts. She hugged me lightly the way you hug a coworker. We took photos, smiled. The next year, they said they were splitting the day, half with me, half with her mother. The year after that, it became, "We're going to stay over there this time, we'll see you later in the week." Later turned into a quick visit, then into a phone call. I told myself it was fair. Of course it was. Families grow, traditions shift, but fairness doesn't erase feeling. Her mother, the other mother, was always present in their stories. Sunday brunches, shopping trips, long phone calls. She lived closer, yes, but closeness isn't only measured in miles. When decisions were made about vacations, finances, even furniture, it was her mother's opinion that carried weight. I'd hear about it afterward, framed as a settled matter. We talked it through, my son would say, we meaning him and his wife, or sometimes I suspected someone else entirely. Once I offered to help with something small. They were talking about repainting their living room, unsure of the color. I used a shade like that years ago, I said gently. It makes the room feel smaller. She smiled. Oh, we already decided. Later, my son mentioned they'd gone with a different color because her mother thought it suited the light better. It wasn't about the paint, it was about whose voice mattered. The weeks after the luncheon passed slowly. I didn't bring it up, neither did they. Silence has a way of becoming permanent if you let it. One afternoon, I ran into a woman from church at the grocery store. She'd been at the luncheon. Your daughter-in-law was lovely, she said, reaching for apples. Such a beautiful tribute to her mother. I nodded. Yes. It was. The woman tilted her head. I didn't realize she was so close with, well, you know. I smiled again, the same smile, the one that keeps conversations moving. Families are complicated, I said. That night I lay awake longer than usual. The house felt louder in the dark, the ticking clock, the hum of the heater kicking on, the faint creak of settling wood. I thought about all the times I'd been careful not to overstep, not to intrude, not to demand. I wondered when care turns into invisibility. The first time I allowed myself to feel angry was over something small. They forgot my birthday, not completely. My son called late in the evening, his voice rushed. I'm so sorry, he said. The day just got away from us. I thanked him, said it was fine. Hung up and sat there staring at the uncut cake I'd bought myself earlier that day. Chocolate, my husband's favorite. I ate a slice standing at the counter, the sweetness cloying in my mouth. It wasn't the forgetting that hurt, it was the ease of it. A week later, my daughter-in-law invited me to lunch, just me. I almost didn't go, but curiosity has its own pull. We met at a small cafe halfway between our houses. She arrived on time, ordered first, smiled politely. We talked about the weather, about work, about nothing. Then she leaned back in her chair and said, I hope you weren't uncomfortable at the luncheon. I looked at her, really looked, the careful makeup, the composed posture, the way she held her coffee like it was an anchor. I was surprised, I said honestly. She nodded as if I'd confirmed something she already knew. I didn't mean to hurt you. I know, I replied. And I meant that too. She hesitated, then said, my relationship with my mother has always been complicated. Carol has been there for me in ways I needed. Carol, the name landed heavily between us. I understand, I said. I understood needing someone. What I didn't understand was why that someone couldn't include me. She smiled again, relieved. I'm glad. We finished our lunch, hugged lightly, left. Driving home, I realized something with a clarity that startled me. She wasn't asking for my forgiveness. She was asking for my acceptance of a decision already made. And for the first time, I considered what it might feel like to stop bending. That night, I stood at my kitchen window, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. I thought about how love doesn't always break loudly. Sometimes it thins. Sometimes it shifts away from you without ever saying goodbye. And in that quiet, another question rose, steady and insistent. If I stopped trying to earn a place that was never meant for me, who would I become instead? After that lunch, I stopped initiating contact. Not as a punishment, not as a test. I simply grew tired of always being the one to reach across a widening space, pretending my arms weren't aching from the stretch. Days passed, then weeks. My phone stayed quiet more often than not. When it did ring, it was usually my neighbor or the pharmacy reminding me a prescription was ready. I noticed how quickly silence becomes familiar when you stop fighting it. I filled my time the way people do when something is missing but unnamed. I reorganized drawers that didn't need reorganizing. I scrubbed the grout in the bathroom until my knees ached. I baked bread I didn't crave just to smell something warm in the house. At the library, I volunteered for extra shifts, grateful for the steady rhythm of returning books to their places, for stories that always knew where they belonged. Every now and then, I caught myself rehearsing conversations that never happened. Things I might say if asked. Things I wanted to explain without sounding wounded. Things I needed them to understand even though I knew deep down they probably wouldn't. One afternoon, my son finally called. "Hey, Mom," he said, the way he always does, cheerful, casual, as if nothing delicate sat between us. "We were wondering if you're free this weekend." "We again, for what?" I asked. "There's a family dinner," he said. "Carol's hosting." I closed my eyes. The name still had weight, not sharp anymore, but dense, solid. "I see," I said. There was a pause. "You don't have to come if you don't want to," he added quickly. "We just thought, I'll think about it," I said, cutting him off gently. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet and considered the invitation. It wasn't unkind. It wasn't malicious. It was simply assumed that I would be willing to step into a space where my place had already been defined for me. That night, I dreamed of my old dining table, the one my husband and I bought secondhand when money was tight. In the dream, it was set for dinner, plates neatly arranged, candles lit. But when I tried to sit, there was no chair left. Everyone smiled apologetically as if to say someone else needs it more. I woke with my heart racing. The day of the dinner came and went. I didn't attend, I didn't call with an excuse. I simply let the absence speak for itself. No one followed up. That hurt more than I expected. It forced me to confront something I'd been skirting around for years. I had made myself easy to overlook by being agreeable. By being patient, by never demanding more than was offered. There's a quiet pride in being the one who doesn't cause trouble. I'd worn it like a badge, but pride has a shadow side. It can convince you that silence is strength when sometimes it's just surrender. A month later, my son stopped by unannounced. I was watering the rose bush when I heard his car pull into the driveway. The roses hadn't bloomed much that year, but I kept tending them anyway. Some habits die hard. "Hi, Mom," he said, stepping out, keys jingling in his hand. He looked older than he used to, tired around the eyes. "Hello," I replied, setting the watering can down. We stood there for a moment, unsure of who should speak first. He finally cleared his throat. "You've been distant." I almost laughed, almost. "I've been present," I said instead. "Just not chasing?" He frowned slightly as if trying to decode that. "We didn't mean for you to feel pushed out." "I know," I said, and again I meant it. We went inside. I poured us tea, the familiar clink of cups grounding me. He sat at the table where he'd done homework as a boy, his long legs folded awkwardly beneath him now. "She didn't intend it the way you took it," he said carefully. "I didn't intend to feel the way I do," I replied just as carefully. He sighed. She's been important to her." "I understand that," I said. "What I don't understand is why that has to mean I'm less." He looked down at his hands, silence stretched. "I never asked to be first," I continued. "I only hoped not to be erased." That word erased hung in the air between us. He swallowed. "She thought you were okay with it," he said softly. "That's the problem," I replied. "Everyone thought I was okay because I never said otherwise." We sat with that truth, letting it settle where it needed to. He left not long after, hugging me tighter than usual. As he drove away, I realized something else. Speaking my truth hadn't brought relief, it had brought clarity. And clarity, while less comforting, is far more honest. Weeks later, the phone rang again. This time it was her. "I wanted to check on you," she said. Her voice sounded sincere. "Tired, maybe?" "I'm fine," I said. She hesitated. "I know things have been complicated." "They have," I agreed. She took a breath. "I hope you know I never meant to replace you." I stared out the window at the rosebush, its leaves dark and glossy in the afternoon light. "Replacement doesn't always come from intention," I said. "Sometimes it comes from repetition." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't know how to fix this." I appreciated her honesty. "I'm not sure it needs fixing," I replied, just acknowledging. We ended the call politely, cordially, with nothing resolved and nothing denied. Afterward, I sat alone and let myself grieve, not just the loss of a role I'd assumed I'd have, but the version of myself that believed patience alone could secure belonging. Healing, I was learning, doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like redirection. I started saying no more often. To invitations that felt obligatory. To conversations that skimmed the surface while ignoring the ache beneath. I began filling my days with things that asked nothing of me but my presence: long walks, old movies, journaling in the quiet hours before bed. One evening, as I wrote by lamplight, a sentence surprised me as it formed on the page. "I am allowed to be more than accommodating." I read it again, slower this time. For years, I defined myself by how useful I was to others, how easy, how understanding. But usefulness is not the same as value, and ease is not the same as love. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it shifted its shape. made it lighter to carry. And somewhere in that shift, I felt something new stirring, not bitterness, not anger, but a cautious sense of self returning to its rightful place. Not at the center of anyone else's life, but firmly within my own. The change didn't announce itself all at once. It crept in quietly, the way morning light slips across a floor before you realize the sun is fully up. After that conversation with my son, after the careful phone call with his wife, I found myself moving through my days differently. Slower, maybe, or more deliberately. I noticed when my shoulders tensed during certain thoughts. I noticed when my jaw tightened at the sound of my phone buzzing. Awareness became my companion, uncomfortable at first, then oddly reassuring. For years, I'd lived as if my place in the family depended on how little space I took up. I'd believed love was something you earned through patience, silence, and endless understanding. But now, standing in my own kitchen, listening to the kettle begin its low whistle, I wondered who had taught me that lesson and why I'd never questioned it. I thought about my own mother. She had been a woman who made herself indispensable, always busy, always helpful. She was the first to arrive and the last to leave, the one who washed dishes at other people's houses without being asked. When she died, people praised her generosity, her selflessness. They said she never thought of herself. At the time, I'd thought that was the highest compliment. Now I wasn't so sure. One afternoon, I was invited to a baby shower for a woman from the library. I almost declined. Crowded rooms made me tired these days, and I wasn't sure I had the energy for small talk. But something nudged me forward, maybe curiosity, maybe a need to see how I fit in places where no one expected anything specific from me. The room was filled with pastel balloons and the soft murmur of polite laughter. I sat near the edge, sipping tea, watching as gifts were opened and passed around. When it was my turn, I handed over a simple book, one I'd loved reading to my son when he was small. The expectant mother smiled warmly, her eyes lighting up. "This was my favorite as a child," she said, genuinely surprised. Something loosened in my chest. Later, as people chatted, she came to sit beside me. "You have a calming presence," she said. "I hope I'm like that someday." I laughed softly. "It takes practice," I replied. Driving home, I realized how different that interaction felt. There was no history to manage, no role to defend, just a moment of connection, uncomplicated and kind. That was when I understood how much effort I'd been spending trying to maintain a relationship that required constant adjustment from only one side. A few weeks later, my daughter-in-law announced she was pregnant. My son called, his voice bright, almost breathless. "You're going to be a grandmother," he said. I sat down slowly. The word echoed differently than Mom had at the luncheon. This one landed with weight and wonder and fear. "That's wonderful," I said, and I meant it, truly. After we hung up, I placed my hand over my heart and waited for the familiar rush of questions to come. Will I be included? Will I be invited? Will I be needed? They came, but quieter this time, less demanding. The pregnancy brought a flurry of activity, doctor's appointments, plans, conversations buzzing with excitement. I heard about most of it secondhand. Occasionally, I was asked for advice, framed gently as if they weren't sure how much I was willing to give. I offered what I could without stretching myself thin. When asked about sleep schedules, I answered. When asked about feeding, I shared my experience without insisting it was the only way. I felt the difference immediately. Giving without expectation felt lighter, safer. One evening, my daughter-in-law came over alone. She sat at my kitchen table, hands folded over her stomach, eyes tired. "I've been thinking," she said after a while, "about us." I waited. "I know I haven't always made space for you," she continued. I didn't realize how much that mattered. I studied her face. She looked sincere, vulnerable even. "I didn't know how to ask for space without hurting you," she added, "so I just took it." Her honesty surprised me. It didn't erase the past, but it softened its edges. "I wish you trusted me enough to talk about it," I said gently. She nodded. "I do now." We sat in silence, the kind that doesn't demand to be filled. When she left, she hugged me, not lightly this time, but with intention. I didn't read too much into it. I simply accepted it for what it was. The baby arrived in early spring on a morning bright with promise. I got the call hours after the birth. A girl, healthy, beautiful. I was invited to visit the next day. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and flowers. Machines beeped softly. My son looked exhausted and radiant all at once. When they placed the baby in my arms, something ancient and familiar stirred inside me. Not ownership, not entitlement. Connection. I whispered her name, feeling its weight settle into me. She opened her eyes briefly, unfocused and curious, then closed them again. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. Love doesn't need a title to exist, and it doesn't disappear just because someone else is called something first. Still, boundaries remained. Carol was there often, involved, helpful. I watched from the side, resisting the urge to compete or compare. This wasn't a contest I wanted to win. Instead, I focused on the moments I was given, rocking the baby while my daughter-in-law showered, bringing soup when nights were long, leaving before I was asked to, honoring the space I'd once feared. Gradually, a new rhythm formed, not the one I'd imagined years ago, but one that fit. One afternoon, as I was leaving, my daughter-in-law said quietly, "I'm glad she has you." She didn't say mom. She didn't need to. Driving home, I felt a calm I hadn't known in a long time, not because everything was perfect, but because I'd stopped trying to control how I was seen. Later that night, I wrote in my journal again. My handwriting looked steadier than it used to. There is dignity in stepping back without disappearing. There is strength in loving without clinging. The pain hadn't vanished. It probably never would, but it no longer defined me. I was learning how to stand in my own life, rooted, present, whole, and that, I realized, was the beginning of healing. Healing didn't move in a straight line after that. It never does. Some days felt settled and grounded, like I'd finally found my footing. Other days, a single sentence or look would undo me, pulling old questions back to the surface like stones rising through water. The baby grew quickly. Too quickly, it seemed. Each visit revealed a new change, a longer stretch of sleep, a different cry, a face slowly learning how to smile. I was invited over regularly, but never spontaneously. There was always a plan, a time window, a sense of structure that reminded me I was a guest, not a fixture. I respected it, most of the time, but respect doesn't cancel longing. One afternoon, as I rocked my granddaughter near the window, I caught my reflection in the glass. I looked older than I felt, softer around the edges, quieter. I wondered what she would know of me when she grew up. Would I be a presence or a memory? A story told occasionally or a voice she'd recognize instantly? That thought stayed with me longer than I expected. A few weeks later, my son invited me to dinner, just the three of us. No baby, no Carol. The invitation felt deliberate, careful, like something that had been discussed beforehand. I arrived early, as I always do. My daughter-in-law greeted me at the door, her smile genuine but cautious. The house smelled like garlic and tomatoes, something simmering on the stove. She'd cooked. That alone felt significant. We ate at the small dining table, the one they'd chosen together. Conversation was polite at first, circling safe topics. Then, halfway through the meal, my son set his fork down. "There's something we need to talk about," he said. I felt my shoulders tense, but I nodded. He glanced at his wife, then back at me. "We've been thinking about how things have been, about the distance." She folded her napkin slowly. "We don't want you to feel like an outsider," she said, "but we also need space to be our own family." I breathed in carefully. I understand that. My son leaned forward. "We want to figure out what this looks like moving forward together." The word together sounded hopeful, fragile but hopeful. I chose my words carefully. "I don't need to be involved in everything," I said. "I just don't want to feel like I have to earn my place." They listened, really listened. No interruptions, no defensiveness. "I didn't realize how often you felt that way," my son said quietly. "That's because I didn't say it," I replied. "I thought love meant staying quiet." My daughter-in-law shook her head slightly. "Love also means being honest," she said, "even when it's uncomfortable." Something shifted then, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to feel. After dinner, we cleared the table together. I dried dishes while she washed, our movements tentative at first, then gradually more natural. It reminded me of the early days of my marriage, when partnership was something you learned through repetition. As I was leaving, she said, "I hope you know it wasn't about choosing one mother over another." I looked at her. "It felt that way," I said, "but I'm learning that feelings don't always tell the whole story." She nodded. "I never had the kind of relationship with my own mother that felt safe," she said. "Carol became that for me before I knew how to explain it." I absorbed that quietly. It didn't excuse the hurt, but it gave it context. Driving home, I felt tired in a good way. The kind of tired that comes from emotional work, from saying things that matter. But clarity has a way of stirring new questions. As the months passed, I noticed something unexpected. Carol began to step back, not dramatically, not announced. Just small shifts, fewer visits, shorter stays, less commentary. I didn't celebrate it. I didn't need to. I simply noticed. One afternoon while I was babysitting, my daughter-in-law said, "Carol's been encouraging me to lean on you more." I looked up, surprised. It wasn't triumph I felt, it was sadness. For all of us, because that too was something I'd learned. Sometimes the people we lean on do so because we haven't yet learned how to trust the ones closest to us. I became more involved with my granddaughter, but on terms that felt healthier. I wasn't the default caregiver. I wasn't the emergency backup. I was present, consistent, and allowed to be myself. One evening, as I read to her on the couch, she reached up and grabbed my finger with her whole hand. The strength of that tiny grip startled me. I laughed softly and my daughter-in-law smiled from across the room. "She likes you," she said. I smiled back. "I like her too." Later that night, alone in my house, I sat with that moment, not as a promise of the future, but as proof of the present. Still, there were days the old ache returned. Especially when I saw photos online, holiday gatherings I hadn't attended, moments I hadn't been part of. Comparison crept in quietly, whispering old fears. But now I knew how to answer it. I reminded myself that love doesn't require constant proximity to be real, that belonging doesn't have to look like control, that my worth was not measured by how often I was included. The real test came unexpectedly. One afternoon, my daughter-in-law called, her voice strained. "Can you come over?" She asked. "I just need help." I didn't ask questions. I grabbed my coat and drove over. When I arrived, she was sitting on the couch, the baby crying in her arms, exhaustion written into every line of her face. I took the baby gently, murmuring softly, rocking her until she calmed. My daughter-in-law watched, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I don't know what I'm doing," she whispered. I sat beside her. "None of us do," I said. "We just learn as we go." She leaned into me then, not fully, but enough to feel. I didn't rush it. I didn't say "I told you so." I simply stayed. That night, driving home, I realized something profound. I no longer needed to be chosen. I was needed, and not because I demanded it, but because I'd made room for myself to exist honestly. The difference mattered. And with that understanding came a quiet sense of peace, not perfect, not permanent, but real. The more I allowed myself to step into that peace, the more I realized how unfamiliar it felt. For years, my sense of purpose had been wrapped around being useful, being the one who filled gaps, smoothed edges, absorbed discomfort so others didn't have to. Letting go of that identity left a quiet space I didn't know how to fill at first. But that space, I discovered, was not emptiness. It was possibility. I began doing small things differently. I stopped rearranging my schedule around everyone else's needs. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center, even though I'd never considered myself artistic. The first day, I sat at a long table with strangers, the smell of paper and paint water filling the room. My hands shook slightly as I held the brush. "You don't have to be good," the instructor said, smiling. "You just have to be willing." That felt like advice meant for more than painting. At home, I moved my husband's watch from the dresser into a small box, not to forget him, but to make room. I donated clothes I'd been saving just in case. I let go of things that belonged to an older version of myself who had survived by staying small. The shift didn't go unnoticed. My son commented on it first. "You seem lighter," he said one evening on the phone. "I feel different," I replied, less afraid of being misunderstood. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad," he said. "So was I." Not long after, my daughter-in-law invited me to attend a parenting workshop with her. "Just if you're interested," she added quickly. "No pressure." I almost laughed at the phrasing. No pressure had once felt like code for don't expect too much. Now it felt like an honest offering. We sat side by side in a small conference room, listening to a speaker talk about boundaries and support systems. At one point, the speaker said, "The healthiest families are the ones where everyone is allowed to be whole." The word stayed with me. Afterward, over coffee, my daughter-in-law said, "I've been thinking about something." I waited. When I thanked Carol as my mom at the luncheon, she said slowly, "I didn't realize how public that choice was, or how final it might feel to someone watching." I nodded. Public moments have a way of solidifying private decisions. She looked down at her cup. I wasn't trying to make a statement, but I see now that I did. I appreciated that she didn't ask for absolution. She wasn't looking for me to erase my pain to ease her conscience. She was simply acknowledging the impact. That moment forced me to see something I'd been avoiding, I said. that I was holding on to expectations that were hurting me. She met my eyes. I don't want to hurt you. I know, I said, and again I meant it. We walked out together, the late afternoon sun warming the pavement. She pushed the stroller, adjusting the blanket around the baby with practiced care. I walked beside her, unburdened by the need to define my role in that moment. Around that time, Carol invited me to lunch. The invitation surprised me. We'd never spent time alone before. I almost declined, but curiosity and a sense of closure I didn't yet understand pulled me forward. We met at a quiet restaurant, neutral ground. She was older than I'd realized, her hair threaded with silver, her posture slightly stooped. She smiled warmly when she saw me. "Thank you for coming," she said. We ordered, made small talk. Then she folded her hands and said, "I owe you something." I waited. "I never meant to take your place," she said. I stepped in where I was needed, not knowing who else stood there. The words were simple, unpolished, honest. "I know," I said. She exhaled, relieved. "I see now that I might have stayed too long." We sat with that truth, letting it exist without accusation. "I care about her deeply," Carol continued, "but I also see that she needs to learn how to trust family that isn't born of crisis." I felt something loosen inside me then, not triumph, not vindication, but understanding. "I spent years thinking I had to compete," I said. "But I don't want to live that way anymore." She nodded. "Neither do I." We parted kindly. No promises, no declarations, just mutual recognition. After that lunch, something shifted in the larger family dynamic, not overnight, but gradually, like a tide turning. I was invited to be part of routines instead of ceremonies. Quiet afternoons, simple dinners, the everyday moments that don't make speeches but build memory. One evening, as I helped bathe my granddaughter, she splashed water onto my sleeve and laughed, a full, delighted sound that filled the room. I laughed too, the sound surprising me with its ease. In that moment, I felt present in a way I hadn't in years, not because everything was healed, but because I was. Later that night, alone again, I thought back to the luncheon, the moment that had once felt like an ending. I realized now that it had been a beginning instead. A painful one, yes, but necessary. Sometimes loss is the only thing that can clear space for truth. And sometimes being overlooked is what finally allows you to see yourself. As I turned off the light and settled into bed, a quiet certainty settled with me. I no longer needed to fight for a role that didn't fit. I was finally living one that did. By the time my granddaughter turned 1, the shape of our family had settled into something recognizable, still imperfect, still evolving, but no longer sharp around the edges. I no longer woke with that familiar knot of anticipation in my chest, wondering where I stood. Instead, I woke with a quieter question: how do I want to spend my day? That difference mattered more than I'd expected. The birthday party was held in their backyard, modest and carefully planned. Pastel balloons tied to the fence, a small table set with cupcakes, the smell of grilled food drifting through the warm afternoon air. I arrived with a wrapped gift and no expectations. Carol was there. For a brief moment, something old stirred, a reflex I hadn't entirely unlearned, but it passed. She greeted me kindly, stepping aside to let me greet the baby first. The gesture didn't feel performative. It felt intentional. I knelt down, held out my arms, and my granddaughter reached for me without hesitation. The weight of her in my arms grounded me. I didn't look around to see who noticed. I didn't need to. As the afternoon unfolded, I found myself laughing easily, chatting with neighbors, helping quietly when needed. My daughter-in-law moved through the party with a new confidence, checking in with me now and then, including me in small decisions: where to place the cake, when to open gifts. It wasn't about control. It was about consideration. At one point, my son came to stand beside me. "Thank you for coming early," he said. "It helped." I smiled. I wanted to. Later, as people gathered around to sing, I stood just behind them, watching my granddaughter clap her hands at the sound. When the song ended, she looked toward me as if searching for something familiar. I met her gaze and smiled. That was enough. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how differently I moved through my role. I no longer offered advice unless asked. I no longer rushed to fill silences. I trusted that my presence was sufficient, and in that trust, something unexpected happened. People leaned in. My daughter-in-law began calling more often, not for help, but to share small things. A funny moment. A question she wasn't sure how to phrase. Sometimes just to talk. One evening she said, "I'm grateful you didn't walk away when things were hard." I paused. "I considered it," I said honestly. She nodded. I'm glad you didn't. So was I, but not in the way she might have thought. I hadn't stayed because I needed to be seen. I'd stayed because I'd learned how to see myself. Still, healing has a way of revealing its final test when you least expect it. It came in the form of another public event. This time, it was smaller. A community recognition dinner for volunteers. My daughter-in-law had nominated me. She told me over the phone, her voice hesitant. I hope that's okay. I sat down slowly. You nominated me? Yes, she said, for everything you do, for who you are. The dinner was held in the same hall as the luncheon, though arranged differently, less grand. As I sat at my table, memories flickered through me. The microphone, the word mom, the way the room had once felt like it was closing in. When my name was called, I stood, my knees steady. I walked to the podium, aware of the quiet attention in the room. I looked out and saw my son, my granddaughter on his lap. I saw Carol seated beside my daughter-in-law. I took a breath. Thank you, I began. My voice didn't tremble. I've learned that service doesn't always look like sacrifice. Sometimes it looks like showing up as yourself and trusting that it's enough. I didn't mention pain. I didn't need to. When I stepped down, my daughter-in-law hugged me, not lightly, not carefully, fully. I'm proud of you, she said. Later that night, as I drove home, the streetlights blurred softly through my windshield. I realized I wasn't replaying the evening in my head the way I once would have. I wasn't searching for hidden meanings or unspoken slights. I was simply content. The next day, my granddaughter said her first word, not mama, not dada, something simpler, something joyful. I was there to hear it, sitting on the floor, blocks scattered around us. My daughter-in-law laughed and clapped, tears in her eyes. She looked at me and said, she sounds like you. I smiled, heart full. That night, as I wrote in my journal, I reflected on how far I'd come from that first, devastating moment at the luncheon. I thought my worth had been dismissed with a single word, but what I'd learned instead was this. Being replaced is an illusion when you stop competing. There is room for many forms of love, and sometimes the deepest healing comes not from being chosen, but from choosing yourself. After that recognition dinner, something inside me finally settled, not in a triumphant way. Not with fireworks or relief that demanded celebration. It settled the way dust does after a long disturbance, quietly, evenly, until the air feels breathable again. I didn't wake up the next morning feeling like a new person. I woke up feeling like myself. That distinction mattered. Life returned to its ordinary pace, but ordinary no longer felt small. It felt earned. Mornings were slower, filled with routines I'd chosen rather than inherited. I still made coffee the same way, still opened the curtains to let the light stretch across the kitchen floor. But I no longer checked my phone first thing, bracing for silence or disappointment. Some days it rang, some days it didn't, and both were okay. My relationship with my daughter-in-law continued to evolve, not dramatically, not perfectly, but honestly. There were moments of closeness that surprised me and moments of distance that no longer scared me. I'd learned that relationships don't collapse just because they breathe. One afternoon, she came over with the baby while my son was at work. It wasn't an emergency. She just wanted company. We sat at the kitchen table, my granddaughter in her high chair banging a spoon against the tray, delighted by the noise she was making. My daughter-in-law laughed, shaking her head. She loves testing boundaries, she said. So do most people, I replied, smiling. She grew quiet then. Watch me for a moment. Can I ask you something? She said. Of course. Did you ever hate me? The question was so direct it caught me off guard. I considered it carefully before answering. No, I said. I was hurt. I was confused. But I never hated you. She let out a slow breath. I think I was afraid you would. I was afraid you already did, I admitted. We looked at each other then, not as mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, not as women navigating roles, but simply as two people who had misunderstood each other for far too long. I didn't know how to let you in without feeling like I was losing myself, she said quietly. I didn't know how to step back without feeling like I was being erased, I replied. Neither of us spoke for a while. The baby filled the silence with happy noise, oblivious to the weight lifting between us. That conversation didn't fix everything, but it named the truth. And naming the truth has a power all its own. As months passed, I noticed how my granddaughter began to recognize me more clearly. She reached for me with purpose now, crawled toward me when I entered the room, rested her head against my shoulder without hesitation. I never asked what she would call me someday. I didn't need to. Names are invitations, but presence is what stays. Carol and I developed a quiet understanding. We were no longer orbiting the same space uncertainly. We spoke easily at gatherings, shared updates, even laughed together once or twice. There was no rivalry left to maintain, only respect. One afternoon, as we stood side by side watching my granddaughter toddle unsteadily across the living room, Carol said, "She's lucky." I nodded, "So are we." Later that evening, alone in my house, I pulled out an old photo album I hadn't opened in years. There were pictures of my son as a baby, my husband holding him with pride and fear mixed in his eyes. There were holidays, birthdays, moments frozen in time. I lingered over a photo of myself I barely recognized, young, smiling, unaware of how much love would stretch me in directions I couldn't yet imagine. I realized then how much of my pain had come from holding on too tightly to how I thought things should look. How motherhood should be acknowledged, how loyalty should be demonstrated, how gratitude should be expressed. Letting go of those rigid expectations didn't diminish my love, it purified it. One evening, my son called me after the baby had gone to sleep. His voice was softer than usual. "I've been thinking about that luncheon," he said, "about how I didn't say anything. I waited. I should have checked on you sooner," he continued. "I should have asked how you felt." "Yes," I said gently, "you should have." He exhaled, "I'm sorry." The apology wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with tears or long explanations, but it was sincere. "I forgive you," I said, and I did, not because he deserved absolution, but because I no longer needed to carry the weight of that moment. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet and felt something close to gratitude for that painful day months ago. Without it, I might never have learned how much of myself I'd been giving away in the hope of being loved properly. Pain has a way of revealing where we've abandoned ourselves. The final lesson came quietly on an ordinary afternoon. I was watching my granddaughter while my daughter-in-law ran errands. The baby grew tired and fussy, rubbing her eyes, resisting sleep. I rocked her gently, humming a tune my own mother used to hum to me. Slowly, her body relaxed. Her breathing evened out. As she slept against my chest, I felt a deep, steady calm settle over me, not because I was needed, but because I was present. In that moment, I understood something I wish I'd known sooner. Love is not proven by being chosen in public. It's proven by showing up with integrity again and again, even when no one is watching. When my daughter-in-law returned, she smiled softly at the sight of us. "Thank you," she whispered. I nodded, no words needed. That night, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked older than the woman in the luncheon hall months ago, but also stronger, more grounded, less eager to please. I turned off the light and lay down, knowing the story was nearly complete. Not because everything was resolved, but because I finally was. The day I realized the story had reached its end didn't come with any ceremony, no announcement, no final conversation that wrapped everything neatly in understanding. It arrived the way most truths do, quietly, disguised as an ordinary moment. I was standing in my kitchen rinsing a mug when my phone rang. It was my daughter-in-law. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. "I do," I said. There was a pause, the sound of her shifting the phone from one hand to the other. "I wanted to tell you something," she said, "before anyone else." I leaned against the counter, listening. "At the next community luncheon," she continued, "I've been asked to speak again about mentorship. About support." I felt a familiar flicker in my chest, not fear this time, but awareness. "And," she said carefully, "I wanted you to know I'll be thanking you." I didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to notice what I felt. There was no rush of validation, no tightening, no hunger for the moment, just calm. "That's kind of you," I said finally, "but you don't owe me anything." "I know," she replied. "I just wanted you to hear it from me." After we hung up, I stood there for a long moment, the water still running softly in the sink. I thought back to the first luncheon, the way that single word "mom" had landed like a door closing, and I smiled. Because now I understood something that would have saved me years of quiet pain if I'd known it sooner. Acknowledgement feels very different when you no longer depend on it. The luncheon came and went. I attended, sat comfortably among familiar faces, listened without bracing myself. When my daughter-in-law spoke, she did mention me, not as a replacement for anyone else, not as a title, but as a presence. A steady one. The applause washed over the room, warm but distant. I clapped politely. I didn't search the crowd for reactions. I didn't need to. Afterward, someone leaned over and said, "You must be so proud." I smiled. "I am." And I meant it for her, for myself, for the journey that had led us here. That evening, I returned home to my quiet house. I set my purse down, hung up my coat, and made tea. The same motions I'd repeated for years, but now they felt anchored, not empty. I sat at the table and thought about all the women who might be listening to this story someday. Women who have swallowed disappointment because they didn't want to seem demanding. Women who have mistaken endurance for love. Women who have been polite their way into invisibility. I wished I could sit across from them, hold their hands, and tell them this. You don't lose your value when someone fails to see it. You don't stop being worthy because your role changes. And you are not selfish for wanting to be acknowledged, you're human. The greatest shift in my life hadn't come from being thanked publicly or included more often. It came from the moment I stopped negotiating my worth. I still love my son deeply. That never wavered. I care for my daughter-in-law with a steadiness that feels earned, not forced. I adore my granddaughter in a way that surprises me daily. But I also love myself now in a quieter, truer way. I no longer shrink to fit someone else's comfort. I no longer wait for permission to belong. I show up honestly, and I trust that the right relationships will meet me there. Some nights when the house is especially still, I think back to that first luncheon, the hush of the room, the hum of the microphone, the moment I realized I wasn't the one being named. For a long time, I thought that moment defined my loss. Now I know it marked my beginning, because being passed over taught me how to choose myself, and choosing myself taught me how to love without fear. Before I turn out the light, I want to ask you something worth sitting with if you stopped waiting to be chosen. Who might you finally become? Thank you for listening.